Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. And welcome to Oblong Online. I'm Susanna Hermans, co-owner of Oblong Books. Before I introduce our guest this evening, if you have questions for Michael or Beth at any time during the presentation, you can either enter them in the chat on the right side of your screen or in the Ask a Question module at the bottom of your screen, and we'll address them at the end of the program. For those of you who would like to purchase a signed copy of For All the People, there is a Buy the Book button at the bottom of your screen. We couldn't be more excited to have Michael Slaby joining us this evening for what promises to be a really interesting discussion about his new book, For All the People, which examines how the internet and modern media have undermined America and how we can reclaim our voices for the good of civic life. Michael Slaby was a fellow at the Shorenstein Center at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and served as Deputy Digital Director and Chief Technology Officer for the 2008 Obama for America campaign, and as Chief Integration and Innovation Officer, where he oversaw all technology and analytics for the 2012 campaign. As a world leader in digital strategy and technology, Slaby has devoted his career to repairing our broken information systems. He currently serves as Chief Strategist at Harmony Labs, where he works on accelerating media reform and transformation. Conducting the conversation with Michael this evening, and who we are delighted to have with us, is Beth Comstock. Many of you may know Beth from the nearly 3 decades she spent at GE as Chief Marketing Officer and then Vice Chair of Innovation. She has also served as President of Integrated Media at NBC Universal, where she oversaw TV ad revenue and digital media efforts, including the early development of Hulu. She is also the author of Imagine It Forward, Courage, Creativity, and the Power of Change. Welcome, Michael and Beth. I'm going to hand the conversation over to you.
Thanks, Suzanne.
Thanks, Suzanne. Thanks so much for hosting and having us and creating a space for this conversation. I'm so excited to be in my hometown bookstore for this conversation. This is really great. Thanks so much. So we thought, as Beth and I were talking about the conversation that we wanted to have with you all tonight, we thought it might be useful to start out by just me telling a little bit of my story about why I wrote this book and sort of where it came from as a way to sort of get into framing a conversation about the relationship between media, technology, politics, misinformation and disinformation, civic life, political dysfunction, a lot of which feels very timely, but sometimes needs a little bit of context. So most of my professional background has been in campaigns, professional campaign politics for the last 15 years. And I actually started working on this book back in 2013. I was one of the original sort of creators of the Obama digital world. I was the chief technology officer for the first campaign back in 2008. And we got credited with an awful lot of firsts, digital firsts, partially just as a function of timing. Chris Sacca likes to joke that timing has a lot to do with the success of a rain dance. And there were some elements to the mythology about the role of digital in the Obama world that started to rise up, particularly after the reelect. And I was curious about what was really new. What had really changed that made the emergence of President Obama as a leader possible? And what was actually unique about what we had done as a way of sort of demystifying the mythology that rose up around the 2008 and 2012 campaigns? And I was working at that time after the reelect, trying to explore what was really different about our information landscape. What had the rise of social media really made possible? And one of the pieces of context I think that's important to think about as we think about that moment in time and the sort of euphoric recall we have about that first Obama campaign, at least some of us, and what is different now. Then, when I first joined that campaign in 2007, it was March 2007, just a couple weeks after the announcement, Facebook had only been open to non-EDU addresses for about a year and a half, and Twitter was like 6 months old. The world of social media was sort of just emerging as this phenomenon that was starting to transform the way, particularly the way we shared and discovered information. But it was still really new. It was still a nascent question. Facebook only had, by the time the campaign ended at the end of 2008, about 100 million accounts worldwide. And so it was a very different moment. And a lot of the innovation that we embraced was not driven by a desire to necessarily transform campaigning or transform communications, but by the political reality that we were going to lose a traditional primary, that a traditional Democratic electorate was going to elect a traditional Democratic candidate in the primary. And that field was full of great candidates. And we weren't the obvious choice. The then senator from Illinois with the funny name that most people had never heard of wasn't going to win that kind of primary. And so what we needed was to use new tools to find new ways to invest new people in the political process as part of the primary in particular. And that gave us a particular posture around experimentation and innovation that meant our moment of what we needed to win coincided with the emergence of new tools in a way that was just serendipity, and that innovation was driven by political reality. What we discovered is that tools for connectivity, for greater connectivity, for establishing relationships at a distance were miraculously wonderful for finding new doors and ways to bring people into the political process. What has emerged over the course of the last 12 years is a world in which those sort of like early experiments in sort of generativity and creativity have become ubiquitous parts of the way we consume information. And the consequences are really profound in what has shifted in how we understand truth, how we consume and how we interpret the worldview around us, and who controls the choices that we're making. One of the reasons why I'm so excited that Beth is taking time to be part of the conversation today is that she's had a front row seat to this evolution, particularly not just in social, but in how social and the sort of re-architecture that social gave us brought to all of information, all of media. That was NBC, CNN, the rise of Hulu, one of the earliest streaming platforms, that this is all in fact related. I think there is a first sort of easy oversimplification that I love to dispel that is sort of a popular blog headline these days, that social media, Mark Zuckerberg is destroying democracy. I think is a funny blog headline, and Facebook certainly has responsibility that it needs to be accepting around the power of its platform relative to what's happening to social cohesion, to our political process, to the quality of information in terms of misinformation and disinformation. But it really is about all of our infrastructure for telling and consuming stories. That the way that we understand the world, that the stories that we share as the foundation for culture and society, the whole mechanism has evolved. And that evolution is outpacing our understanding of the tools in ways that make it really tough for us to be good consumers of information and to remain in sort of productive community particularly with people with whom we disagree. That there's an enormous amount of sorting pressure built into the algorithms that help decide what we see, what we consume, and the stories that sort of rise in our sections of the world that drive us toward an ideological polarization that's ultimately pretty unhealthy. And so one of the places where I'd love to start, and I want to that's just the sort of context of like, why write this book? Where did it begin? Book projects are long. It took 7 years to write this book. As I was joking with Beth yesterday, in terms of the timing of this conversation, this is very much my contribution to a conversation that's been going on for a while. I did not invent the idea that social media has civic consequences that we need to address, but it's very, very timely given the election that we just experienced, the nature of dysfunction that we feel about civic life and about culture and society, and importantly, what we can do about it. That if you feel like civic life politics are dysfunctional, if you feel sort of a struggle to consume healthy information, you're not alone, and it's not your fault, but it's also not inevitable. And so one of the questions I wanted to help invite Beth into the conversation with was, were those, a decade ago in sort of the NBC, in your experience with the first streaming platforms, and how this shifted everything from editorial to monetization at NBC, is to bring some of your experience, your depth, sort of the depth of your experience around how media evolved in that decade into this conversation. And then I hope people will start dropping questions into the chat that we can bring in as well.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Michael, and great book. I'm really, I'm glad you put this together. I do think it's a outline of a lot of what can we do. I'm sure you're hearing that a lot from people. I know we'll get into that. What can we do? That's what I found particularly valuable here, is what can we do? And as somebody who's been in media for a while, I guess the first thing I would say is just that certainly the arc of media has always been about change. So the fact that we have social media might have been expected even a decade ago. We didn't know exactly how it was going to unfold. If I take you back a decade, I mean, the TV networks, the biggest disruption they had, certainly, let's say from a news perspective, but all media, was the arrival of cable. Up until that point, it was, remember, and TV was the big disruptor of radio, and on and on. But cable TV had been a bigger disruptor, and they had just sort of gotten themselves comfortable with cable, and then along comes Silicon Valley based technologies. And I think if you look back 12 years ago, people, like you said, Facebook in 2008, I find that hard to believe they only had 100,000 accounts. That
100 million by the end of the campaign. 100 million.
Okay. 100 in 2008, they had 100 million.
Yeah.
When you first started, they only had a few. They were still small. So, I mean, even in 2000, when I was in media looking at this and examining it, first of all, we never expected any of these platforms to have the impact that they've had. We thought you when you're in the incumbent, you can never imagine that somebody is going to disrupt you. At the time, a lot of the conversation was about all content should be free. I mean, it still is kind of those kind of debates that we're having. Some of the fights that we had early on were between, hey, it should be free, and what's our content worth? I think now we've gotten into a place,
especially when it comes to some of the most important content we rely on around news, our habits around what is free and what is not aren't necessarily aligned with what we need most for civic life to work effectively.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think not everybody obviously shares the same opinion about what we need
Sure.
in terms of content and their content diet. And if I look back a decade ago, I mean, so much has changed in that. The kind of just snackable content that we all can get, things like sports scores and weather and information like that has been commoditized. So opinion has become something that is, you think of commoditized, but not really. I mean, when you think about opinion has come forth because it is so unique, tied to an individual. I think that's changed a lot about it. So I don't know. Those are just a few.
Yeah, I think that's really important. The history of how media has evolved is sort of a big subject at the beginning. But I try to spend the first half of the book helping sort of locate us in history about, like, why do we feel that, like, why does everything feel so messed up? And one of you talked about sort of TV disrupting radio, cable disrupting TV, and that evolution. In that evolution, that's basically the same path we've been on since mass printing in the 15th century.
Yeah,
that we've added more and more channels over time, each new one sort of disruptive in its own way. I think what is distinct about the rise of social is that it shifted us from a channel-based world to a graph-based world. And the difference is that our roles in communications and storytelling are much more variable now. We have a lot more power. More of us have the ability to tell more of our own stories. We are all creators and publishers and distributors of information in a way that shifts the way that we expect content to flow it shifts the predictability of where content is. That content that is published in one place doesn't stay put, right? Even a news story might get more consumed, and this is one of the challenges around the business model of journalism, gets consumed on Twitter or on Facebook more than it gets consumed directly from the publisher. And by being the fabric that sort of knits everything together, the technology platforms have basically taken all the revenue out of the system, right? And they have disintermediated publishers from audiences in ways that in a channel-based world, a publisher uses a media channel to reach an audience in a pretty stable, pretty hierarchical way, where the predictability of those roles helps us predict revenue and control how information flows, and also lets us control what gets published. One of the things that's been I think one of the really good consequences of this shift is that the breakdown of sort of stable gatekeepers means that it helps contribute to this rise of more storytelling, and that more people have the capacity to tell stories in society than ever. The problem with that is we also lost the function that gatekeepers played in helping us understand what is credible and what is authoritative, right? That it used to be the role of the editorial and sort of the sort of gatekeeping structure around what got published and what got distributed that helped us understand what was credible and who was an authority. Without those things, I think we run into a situation where we all have to decide for ourselves what is credible and what is authoritative. But we live in a world where doing that is actually incredibly difficult to do effectively. And one of the challenges I think we face, and that I think we need to address, is getting to a place where we can distinguish between types and intent of content. And you mentioned this in the shift, is that opinion as news is an interesting shift, right? Commentary and analysis have always been part of journalism, but distinguishing between information about what happened versus analysis about what you think I should think about what happened is a really interesting sort of stress on the concept of news.
Yeah, and I mean, you said it, Michael. You had a great line that perhaps the technology and the explosion, the platforms have evolved faster than our understanding of it. And I think that's a great example that you've just pointed out here. Opinion, in many cases it says opinion, but not even does it always say opinion. I mean, certainly right. if you grew up in a traditional news journalism world of kind of newspapers, you labeled something opinion. You're expected to know what's opinion. And what are you recommending people do to do their homework? I mean, first of all, who has time to do their homework?
Well, it's almost impossible to do enough homework. I mean, I think one of the realities is that we are living in a world where it's pretty tough to be a good, healthy consumer of information. It's very hard to have balanced, careful media consumption habits. Because it's not really in the platform's interest for us to be balanced or healthy. It is in their interest.
What do you recommend we do?
Yeah, I think what we can do as individuals is there's a whole bunch of, as mentioned, the first part of the book is about trying to locate us in history. The second part of the book is very much about where do we go. And I actually think there's a whole bunch of things in a bunch of categories that all need to happen at the same time. One has to do with the platforms embracing the responsibility that they have, whether they like it or not, as our public sphere, and thinking about the design of their interfaces and how they encourage us to consume information. While we're waiting for that to happen, we need to focus on sort of the advocacy at a public level for helping articulate what we need and want from these systems that gets then expressed as both cultural requirement and regulation. As individuals, there is I sort of can't stop myself in the book from making the Spider-Man joke a couple of different times around, with great power comes great responsibility. If we have more power to understand and consume what we want, to tell stories as we want, we also have to accept the responsibility of differentiation. Now, you just mentioned that in newspapers, we used to label things. In our current platforms, the labeling is wildly insufficient. The indistinguishability of content is actually one of the features that keeps us consuming in infinite ways. And so this is where the design of the system is sort of working against our psychology. In order to get ourselves away from that addiction and away from the pressure of information overload, one of the simplest things we can do is turn off all the notifications on our phones. The only notifications that you probably want to have to be really healthy are something from like your wife or your mom or both, depending on your family.
Hello, Mrs. Slaby.
I see my mom in the audience.
Yes.
Don't say anything embarrassing. But is really a way of reclaiming the way that we choose to engage with information rather than being at the mercy of the sort of psychology and addictiveness of these platforms. Take all your social media applications off your home screen, change your phone to black and white. Just trying to get a little bit of cognitive distance from the sort of addictive nature of these platforms gives us a little bit of opportunity to reclaim some agency about what we're consuming. Once we do that, then we need to start trying to make more diverse choices about what we consume. One of the pressures that we see in tools like Twitter and Facebook is that as we use them, both these platforms are really, really pressured around confirmation bias, giving us things that we already agree with or things that enrage us. What you believe or what you're afraid of or sort of what you're outraged by. And those two sort of instincts around information are not really what we need to understand the world with clarity and nuance. And so trying to be really purposeful about what we consume and where we get it from. I try really hard as somebody who's politically very liberal. I've spent my whole career working in Democratic Party, Democratic politics. I go out of my way to read redstate.com almost every day. And it's a way of helping me understand a broader set of perspectives about what people in the world and in my country and in my neighborhood think and believe about the world. And it helps me get out of the sense that what I think is the only thing to think. That when we are sorted into these small categories, it may be more inefficient for me to go out and sort of choose to sort of consume some of this different types of content. But it helps me understand that the world is bigger than what it looks like from my little narrow view.
Those are great tips. I mean, we also have this whole other, with this is probably too much to talk about today, but just, psychological operations, psyops from counterterrorism sources of other governments, which again adds another level of know the source of information and go to the about. Just look at the about tab.
Absolutely. And misinformation, propaganda is not new. Right. Misinformation and disinformation have been around sort of forever as part of political operations and sort of various forms of conflict. The problem we see now is that this sort of indistinguishability challenge, and because we don't have good labels for credible and not credible, for authoritative and not authoritative, we tend to substitute other things like proximity or confirmation bias. So if somebody near me or somebody that I agree with about other things shares something with me, I'm likely to believe that it's accurate, especially if I see it a lot. And in a world where we sort of bounce into these sort of what Eli Pariser calls filter bubbles, where we're sort of sorted together with other people with whom we mostly agree, we tend to see a lot of the same stories. And that repetition makes us think it must, if I see it all the time from lots of places, it must be true. That's not actually a good proximity. Is not actually a great substitute for credibility. And celebrity is not a great substitute for authority. And we see this a lot in a moment where, during a pandemic, when what we really need is credible technical content. We need public health content. And the people the storytellers and the people with that information that we most need to hear from are some of the worst people at leveraging new systems. The CDC is not known as like the most innovative communications organization in the world, right? Agencies and institutions really struggle to build enough content and to tell stories in enough places in enough ways with enough velocity to be able to compete in this sort of information landscape with these other pieces. And so part of what we need around things like systemic misinformation or disinformation campaigns, the distinction being Misinformation is incorrect information that we share sort of accidentally. Misinformation is meant to mislead. And in both those cases, we need systems to help us. It is not a reasonable expectation that as just a normal person going about our lives, we're going to be able to sort of distinguish psyops from a foreign actor from healthy information. It's not realistic. And this is where, the platforms need to accept more responsibility for the nature of the public sphere that they are creating. And this is where ultimately technology regulation and media regulation needs to re-examine the nature of these platforms.
Well, and to that point, Michael, Lauren Rosenthal's put a question up here for you to consider about a government that has taken action. Lauren asked, what do you think about the Australian law that requires social media outlets to pay news publishers for content? Obviously, it's gotten a lot of attention and we're all watching to see what happens. What's your view on it?
Well, first of all, Lauren, thanks for the question. Thanks for dropping in. And I encourage everybody to start dropping more questions into the Q&A. We'll start pulling them into the conversation as we go. I think the Australian law is a really good attempt. One of the things that's being addressed here is the disintermediation that I was talking about before, which is that Facebook and Twitter and Google, a lot of these platforms are benefiting from an ecosystem of information and an economy of attention where they don't have to create content. And so they are not responsible for the costs of their own supply chain. And they benefit from that disintermediation in ways that make the quality and ability of publishers and creators to not be compensated effectively for what they're creating. And this dramatically reduces the certain types of very high quality content that is expensive to create and that we actually really need in society, particularly things like news, investigative reporting, local news, which has been decimated by this shift in economics. That the inability to create revenue in a community in order to provide information to a community, that sort of the closed or smaller system being sort of broken for sort of a nationalized system or globalized system, is actually one of the reasons why we have such information deserts. And so what we see in Australia is the government trying to create a more productive market by requiring Facebook to basically pay for the supply chain of information that's driving their system. I think we see governments outside the US working much harder to engage this question. We see in the EU a privacy law that is really directed toward citizens having a say and control over how their data is used, who uses it, how it's used, when it's used. That I think is the law is called GDPR. And it's really a good model for starting to think differently about the trade-offs that we are making. Right? The trade-off that we make to use a free service, there's a long-standing joke in Silicon Valley, which is if a product is free, you're the product. And there's a lot of truth to the reality that our attention and our behavior is what is being sold to whoever has the money to pay, whether that's a brand looking to sell me a product or a political group looking to shift my opinion or get me to do something or change my perspective or vote. And selling behavior puts us in a place where we are being controlled more than we think. And that we are losing individual agency in a set of systems that are meant to give us the greater connectivity, is meant to create empathy and help us maintain relationships at a distance and enjoy a more diverse, wider set of perspectives than we could on our own. And what we need from law, like privacy laws and laws around how the businesses work in these systems, is a wider public view of the impact and consequences of what has arisen. I think one of the things that I think is really important to acknowledge about the rise of the internet and the rise of social media is that in the early days of that innovation, right, started back in the 70s in sort of DARPA and the world of academia, there was sort of this one sort of naive cyber utopian idea that greater connectivity was going to inherently lead to sort of more pluralistic, more empathetic society, that it was going to be inexorably better for liberal democracies. And I think the challenge with that belief that those things were implicit is that we didn't make them explicit requirements of the systems. And as a result, we haven't gotten a lot of the implicit public goods that we had hoped for because we didn't demand them. The good news is, as Susanna is starting to say, and Vanessa is asking about some questions about regulation, is that we can have this conversation anytime. We can pick this up now. It's not too late. We have not crossed some Rubicon where democracy is incompatible with modern technology. That's just a
so Michael, let's click in on Vanessa's question a bit more.
Absolutely.
Why hasn't the U.S. come up with more regulation? And she believes that that Mark Zuckerberg's begging for regulation. That might be an interesting debate we could have as to whether he's really regulating, or it's kind of like regulate me, knowing that it will never happen if he keeps asking for it.
Right. Thou dost protest too much. So two things. One, I think one of the challenges around why haven't we up to now has to do with other political dysfunction that we face. One of those dysfunctions is that most of the elected officials, certainly at the national level, don't really understand this problem. And because we haven't quite gotten our head around, and our leaders have not had a great handle around what the consequences of these platforms were going to be, we allowed all of these questions around sort of privacy and our public sphere to be privatized. And we said, hey, Facebook, while you're giving us more photo sharing, could you figure out privacy in a way that just works for everybody? Thanks, that'd be great. Rather than having a robust public process that helps inform a set of public principles about what we want and what we demand and how we want these platforms to innovate, that we did not give them enough direction, public direction, about what we needed and what we wanted from a more diverse public sphere. So there's a lack of leadership and a lack of understanding on one side. The other question here around Zuckerberg begging for regulations, you see, if you subscribe to any of the political daily newsletters like Axios AM, Facebook sponsors Axios AM every morning. Or
they've gotten a real. They like have every day. They've got their positioning.
They got it locked down.
They've locked it up for a long time.
And it says Facebook wants better internet regulation. And I think there's two things in that statement. One, I think it's true. I actually think Zuckerberg is desperate for someone else to take the responsibility away from him for making these decisions because he's terrified of what
I know, but as somebody who's worked in a company, I also know you take the action before the action is given to you. You have two minds. You do have agency. That being said, I can also say, having worked in companies, that regulation also requires you to be better because it's raising the bar. I've seen that in the climate space, in the green energy space. So do you think he's recognizing that he can't do this alone?
I think he is desperate for someone to help shoulder the responsibility. I also think he's like a lot of people who have a lot of disproportionate power in our systems, is really happy to be regulated by regulations that he helps write. I don't think he thinks he will ultimately be disempowered by the regulatory framework that comes from the process, which he should be, and his company should be. I think you used a really important word in your point about sort of demanding better behavior, which is the word better. And I think what we see when we watch, and we're picking on Mark, but when we see Mark Zuckerberg go and testify in front of Congress and have to explain his business model to the congressman, what we essentially hear back is the congressman saying, please be better, but not defining better. And that's the public conversation we need to have that shapes both the cultural demand and the regulatory conversation about what does it mean to be better? What does it mean for Facebook to accept more responsibility for the content and experience that they're creating and what it's doing to our civic life?
Do you think employees have a more powerful voice in this? I mean, we
Huge
certainly are
power.
seeing a lot of it from Facebook, Google. I mean, that may be a really interesting way to get change to happen.
They have a huge amount of power. And I think we're starting to see it start to shift. I think the people I know inside Facebook know that Facebook can and needs to be a better actor relative to political and civic life. And I think one of the things that if you talk to Silicon Valley companies that they worry about the most is the constant battle for talent. And that battle is starting to include their position relative to these kinds of questions and others. But certainly it is no longer sustainable for bad actors to stay bad actors and expect to be able to compete for talent in a way that makes any kind of sense.
Yeah.
And so I do think, we start to see, employees inside Amazon unionizing. We're starting to see employees inside Facebook and, publishing really damning intense public letters around there. Right before the election, we saw a really wonderful public letter from the Facebook engineering team about the things that they knew that they could do right away to improve the quality of election information on their platform. And they just publicized it because they recognized that making better choices was at odds at times with the economics demanded by a publicly traded company. And this is where regulation has to come into play because we have a pretty sort of intense culture of sort of short-term profitability around the economics of American capitalism. And it's very difficult, even for actors like Facebook who want to be better long-term actors, to forego short-term profit in order to do that. And we need them to, because they're unbalanced.
Yeah, and I'm going to go to Rick's question, which I think is tied into that. Rick asks, do you think the not-for-profit / someone rich buys a newspaper is a viable model? I mean, we've gotten to basically sponsorship journalism in some ways, where, as Rick's saying, rich person buys out a very well-established media company. Is that going to last? I mean, we have a lot of rich people, but is that going to? And then also, I'll save the second part of the question.
Okay, we had the tradition, the history of news in America is one of subsidy, right? The newspapers originally in America were owned by political parties back in the 18th century. They weren't originally sort of like independent, sort of for-profit businesses the way that they have emerged over the course of the 20th century as sort of competing in the same attention economy of information with all this other types of content. We have treated the economics of news differently historically. And I think it may be the case that it needs its own business model.
I'm with you. I've long thought that's one of the issues.
Yeah, whether it's nonprofit, whether that it's a co-op, local co-ops for information are really interesting. Benefactor subsidy might be part of the answer. Jeff Bezos buying the Washington Post, the Murdochs and their ownership of Fox, the Mercer's funding of Breitbart. Now, whether those things are news or not is a different debate. Mark Benioff buying Time, yeah. Right? That we have different kinds of subsidies so that an investigative report on corruption at the Justice Department doesn't have to compete with a cat video of my cat sleeping on a Roomba. That video is just more fun. It's really, really difficult to ask those things to be competing in the same economy, in the same interface, in the same ways. And it's why we see the sensationalism of algorithmic headlines, right?
And those examples, Michael, you're using are all very large national or international platforms. What about local news? Does this model help local news?
We see some of these models working best at the local level because small nonprofit journalism is hard to do at a national level. It's hard to run a nonprofit that's that big. And so places like the Texas Tribune, which does an exceptional job covering the Texas State House, providing really robust, detailed, thoughtful local news information about local politics inside Texas. Now it's at the state level. Texas is big, but works really, really well. It may be the case that those sort of co-op models, right, that people like the Banyan Project are experimenting with in smaller cities, co-op models might work really well for local journalism. But I think the key here is I talked about the sort of indistinguishability of content. It relates to the sort of distinguishing the economics of types of content as well. That like how creators are paid, how authors are paid, how news is funded. These are questions that I think are nuanced and complicated and need nuanced, complicated answers that a single market of attention is probably not going to serve us all that well.
Especially on platforms that started believing content is free.
Right.
Jeff Christensen is asking a question, and I'm going to jump around a little bit, but he says that back in the 80s, he was excited that more information channels would result in this global village and we'd understand each other, back to what you were saying earlier. But, he's expressing the tribalization that's happened. And he asked a really interesting question, 2 questions. What incentive does the first generation of social media consumers have to willingly examine this and alter their behavior? So what's our responsibility as consumers of social?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of that
and
is.
He's also saying, should it be taught in schools or something?
The second question is 100% yes. Media literacy has to become part of a fundamental understanding of what it means to be literate. If we're going to be able to embrace and use these systems with any kind of power, there's a really wonderful nonprofit in New York called the Take Two Film Academy, led by Megan Kiefer, that is doing just that, trying to create media literacy as a fundamental pillar of literacy, along with reading, writing, arithmetic. So yes, the first question around, will people, or what incentive do people have to examine their behavior? The incentive is that it feels disgusting and terrible to engage in our civic life right now for a lot of people. And I think one of the reasons why I'm so optimistic about our potential to transform these systems is that almost universally, when I talk, regardless of ideology or party or background, there's a really consistent sense that what we're doing is not working well for us. That the way we're consuming information, the way sort of we're choosing leaders, our sort of democratic focus on elections instead of governing, that all these things feel like a dysfunction. And so I think people are eager, if we can provide healthier mechanisms, I think people will shift to them in droves. And I think people would accept healthier interfaces inside the systems where they already are. So inside Facebook, for instance, which is still, by far the dominant platform, especially for the people you're talking about, first generation social media consumers. So Facebook knows what I'm seeing and what I'm not. I don't know what I'm not seeing. Facebook could, in the language you use around the global village and sort of breaking down tribalization, help me see beyond the 4 walls of the community and the assumptions that I bring to the conversation. They could do that tomorrow, right? They could change their interfaces in ways that help us by occasionally and sort of with kindness and concern, confronting us with information that helps challenge our bias. Now, it is exhausting to live in a world where we are constantly confronted. And so we have to balance the sort of belonging and safety of community with the challenge of the unfamiliar and the discomfort of sort of bumping up against things that we don't understand and that we need to challenge our own ideas. But a healthier balance than what we have now, my experience in this conversation with a lot of people in a lot of different places is that most people want that. Most people want a civic life that feels like self-government and that feels like, local representation, local information, helping us understand and operate and live in better community with more people and less conflict. Now, platforms that are optimized for conflict aren't going to give us that. And this is where the public demand has to start to drive innovation behavior. And that's very, very possible, right? It's not instantaneous. It's going to have to be sustained, and it is going to have to involve legislation. It's going to have to involve regulatory environment that is updated. Most of our sort of internet and telecommunications law originated with terrestrial radio, right? The law that we keep amending was passed in the 30s, Telecommunications Act, and it keeps getting amended, but it hasn't been substantially amended really since 2006. And that was a long time ago. Right?
Having worked in both news and entertainment media companies, I can tell you it used to be a time when some of the most powerful people in those organizations were the standards and practices organizations.
Sure.
So there are a lot of behaviors that in a decade or more have been upended. John Epstein's asking a question. You're talking about different responsibilities. He's asking if campaigns bear some responsibility here to talk to a broader segment. I mean, as a marketer, I know the value of the targeting of Facebook in particular. It is, if you're looking to target people, it is incredibly effective.
Yes.
So he's asked, I think, a really thoughtful question of, do campaigns bear responsibility to try to reach more people, especially given their mandate? And then he's asking, do you, given your experience, do you think that Obama targeted a wider audience than what we've seen in 2016 and 2020?
Yeah, they're related, but really different questions. The first is, I think political campaigns bear a lot of responsibility for the tone and tenor of political conversation, embracing sort of violent language. We talk about enemies instead of opponents. We talk about killing people instead of beating people. Like, there's a lot of responsibility to go around in the political world about the temperature of our political conversation. There are a lot of intense disagreements in politics, and some of them are genuinely existential. Not all disagreement is existential. Not all disagreement means that if we lose a vote or don't get what we want, that the world is going to end. Not every election can be the most important election of my lifetime. But that kind of, back to the sort of this question about the tyranny of outrage, that kind of thing works really well for keeping people engaged, keeping people donating in particular, because it's a good way to keep people scared. And othering is another consequence of this sorting behavior, and the effectiveness of othering, especially in a time of a pandemic, especially in a moment where other people, for public health reasons, might actually be dangerous to us, and that we need some physical distance from other people to stay safe. We are even more susceptible to arguments about othering. And I think it's why we see conspiracy theory and misinformation around those kinds of othering and nationalism being so effective right now, and that we have to push back really hard against. And so, do political campaigns bear responsibility? Political campaigns are about winning elections. I think government bears a lot of responsibility for who and how they talk. I think you're going to probably have to force political campaigns to be more general in their targeting by making the targeting less granular. I don't know that political campaigns are likely to embrace culturally things that are, like, to Beth's point, about incredibly effective tactics because they want better sort of civic discourse. I think you're going to have to force them to be better actors, because I think they're part of the sort of culture of, winning at all costs, and the purpose of political parties being about victory and not about leadership is a cultural shift that I think is going to be quite hard to undo inside both parties. And so I think the campaigner responsibility is going to be something that that has to be imposed as a function of, how granular is political ad targeting? When can you run political ads? How do you spend that money? How are we, enabling or disenabling certain tools that are used in service of voting and civic life that were designed for commercial behaviors, where the consequences of hyper targeting and hyper personalization might be lower, or at least different. Whether higher or lower, I think, is a value judgment that I'm making, but certainly the consequences are profound and distinct. Did the Obama campaign target more widely? I think this is a really different question. And I think what we see is going back to where we started with my story around the 8 and 12 campaigns, and so what those experiences were like, and what they revealed is that these tools were a lot less mature. The algorithms inside Facebook, inside the news feed, hadn't been running on us for as long. So we hadn't been as sorted as we have been now a decade later. They also weren't as ubiquitous. And so they weren't quite, the sort of tilting of power in the landscape wasn't quite as complete. And so I think in many ways, what we see is the 2012 campaign of the reelect was probably the last campaign in the sort of trajectory of American political campaigns that has basically been the same since 1896. The last campaign where we really see two campaigns arguing over the sort of core question about leadership and the direction of the country, that we're having a genuine argument with each other in sort of in a public space that was largely overlapping, even if we already were starting to see sort of the partisanship and polarization of news start to shift how news was consumed. I think 16 is the first election where we see two totally different campaigns targeting totally different people, sort of competing over whose group of people is going to be the largest, but in totally different language that's not a debate at all. They're just coexisting geographically. And the point is to see whose community is the most outraged about what's happening on election day for the purposes of who can get the most votes. But it's not really an argument. It's not really a debate about the nature of America or leadership or the direction of the country. It's really two totally disentangled parallel operations that don't intersect at all. And so I think it's really hard to compare the targeting that we were leveraging in 12 with what was going on in 16 and 20, because I think the nature of the campaigns was totally different. I also think the tools weren't as mature. So the capacity, the granularity of targeting available now wasn't available to us in 2012. I think if you'd handed us those tools, we probably would have used them. Now, President Obama, then Senator Obama, was telling a very different story pre-election day about a new kind of politics than what we have been hearing in elections in the last couple of cycles. We've been hearing a lot about unification post-election day, sometimes disingenuous, sometimes not, sometimes complicated, sometimes not. But that was a really different conversation, just rhetorically, about the nature of leadership and a sort of culture inside the campaign. Lauren's talking about it in the comments here, about sort of the nature of the conflict was really different. And it was partially a function of trying to demonstrate that politics could be different. I think there's an open question about whether that was naive, that once President Obama got into office, that not recognizing that Mitch McConnell was not actually interested in being in a debate with him might have led to a less effective presidency as a result. Now, that dynamic also has to change. Public service being about service, being about dialogue and debate and about compromise are the things that we need from leadership. And so one of the questions that I think I get to in the book, and I think is really important for this conversation, is that ultimately, my expertise in history, my work has led me to these questions around the role of media and technology and politics and civic life, history, society. But what I believe about our need to address them now is that America and humanity are facing questions about the future that we are unlikely to be able to answer well or effectively without systems that help us have a healthier civic discourse. That questions about the relationship between humans and the natural world, between the consequences for getting that relationship wrong over the last several centuries, for the future of American capitalism and the nature of our social contract. These are really complicated, nuanced, historical questions that require a lot of time and discernment. And none of the things that I just described describe our current media systems. Our current media systems are allergic to nuance. They don't provide context. They keep the history of everything that we say, but our experience is historyless. Our experience is an instantaneous sense of overload all the time. And there's no accountability when there's no memory. And so the fixing of discourse is not only sort of timely given the experience that we've been having, the sort of questions around things like misinformation and disinformation, but it's also in some ways a necessary requirement to me, to the broader conversations that we need to be having if we're really going to embrace a future where these systems are working for us. And that's why I think there's a lot of urgency right now, and why I'm actually really glad to see in the early days of the Biden administration, at least from the perspective of who's being appointed to the Lena Khan at the FTC, for instance, and to the FCC, we see a commitment to these questions as important. My worry about the Biden administration from the beginning has been that the urgent will crowd out the important. And that was the excuse made in 2009 when the Obama administration first started, that the global economic crisis and the Great Recession was so urgent that worrying about the accountability for how we had gotten there took a back seat to just recovering. And I am concerned, and I'm hopeful right now because I think we're seeing the right kinds of priorities. But I remain concerned that the crisis of the pandemic and the coronavirus and COVID and the subsequent economic consequences that we're still feeling the effects of and are going to be in the workforce and in our habits about work, or we're going to be feeling for years, are going to crowd out the civic crisis that we're in. And that we managed to elect President Biden, I think, is a statement about stability in a lot of ways, and a statement about decency, I think. But I also think it is insufficient. It is, we remain, I have joked that we remain at the bottom of a hole. We may have stopped digging, but we still are looking up. And we need to start treating it as a relationship we need to heal, our civic life and our community and our willingness to engage and be in community with people with whom we disagree, with whom we are unfamiliar. And I think, go ahead, Beth.
No, I was just going to ask, are you, in the time we have left, are you optimistic that, I mean, that is, I love the way you brought this full circle. It's the subtitle of your book about reclaiming our civic life. I mean, this is about media, but it's about reclaiming our civic life. And I think you make a really compelling connection there. Are you optimistic that people are ready to do what it takes to reclaim our civic life?
I am. And I am because of my, like I sort of described before, because of my experience talking, not watching political Twitter, but talking to people in community all over the country. I see an incredible desire for the end of this dysfunction. And I think the challenge that we face is that anyone who's ever tried to repair a relationship, that first step back toward each other is an act of forgiveness. And that's very, very hard. And what I wonder, and the question that I like to leave people with as we think about our own behavior, is how would we, if we thought about that sort of that act of forgiveness, of like thinking about a world in which we weren't at each other's throats, ideologically in particular, how would we behave differently if we believed that the effectiveness and the health of our civic life was dependent on those other people, was dependent on people with whom we disagree, participating vibrantly and equally in a system? How would we behave differently if we really, really embraced the idea that our civic life depended on them? I think our behavior would change immediately. And I think it would start to shift the way we engage, the way we argue, the way we campaign, to Johnny's point. And one of the things that keeps me optimistic is that in the graph that I talked about, where we are all sort of connected in this messy network, people are the most numerous node. So of all the things being connected, whether it's us or a company or a media company, there are more people in the graph than any other type of actor. So if our behavior changes, the graph changes, period. We have that collective power. And so in a moment where collective power is easier to harness, we need to do the work to harness it in the right direction. And this book is my contribution to the conversation. And I hope people find it useful.
It's a great handbook. Thanks for the opportunity to share this time with you, Michael. Some really powerful thoughts here.
Thank you for being part of the conversation with me. I appreciate it.
What a wonderful conversation. Thanks to you both so much for joining us tonight. I think that's a beautiful place for us to leave people's minds for the evening. Michael Slaby's For All the People can be purchased signed copies at oblongbooks.com, or you can click the buy the book button on the screen. We want to have a special thank you to Disruption Books for making this event possible. And thank you to all of you who joined us tonight via Crowdcast. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thanks all very
Have a
much.
good
Thanks for
night.
being here.
Bye,
Have a great
everyone.
night.